Now, most of you know that Melissa and I got to go see Neil Diamond yesterday, or Friday. That's part of why I'm showing this video today. But the other part is how much it connects with what we've been talking about in the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel of Mark. What Jesus is doing. We've been taking the Gospel apart and looking at the pieces and what Mark is trying to tell us. And all of that's great, and I've enjoyed it. I hope you have, to see how it fits together and the stories he shares, what he leaves out even, to make his point. But we're starting to come down to it. We have a couple of weeks left before we see the conclusion of that gospel. And we come across the art of love. It was late at night in the courtyard of the high priest, and there was much more activity there than normal for this time of night. Many chief priests and elders and scribes had been called together for a clandestine meeting. Some of them had refused to come because this was unorthodox. But the high priest stood in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he remained silent, made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Beloved?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witness do we need?" 3 days earlier, the Saturday night before Jesus would make his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, he and his disciples were having a dinner in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. I know we're in chapter 14 and we've already gone a couple of days into Holy Week, but if you look at the way that it's written, the way the 14 was laid out, this is a flashback. A flashback, verses 3 through 11. Let me share with you what this flashback is about, and then I'll explain to you why it's not sequentially ordered. They're at this dinner. Lazarus is there, his family, his two sisters. Simon the leper is there. There's other people from Bethany, this little town outside of Jerusalem. We're all at this dinner. And Mark tells us a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard. Very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Mark tells us that some were saying to themselves, "Why was the ointment wasted like this? It could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. Wherever the gospel is proclaimed, what she has done will be spoken of." And it was then that Judas had gone to the chief priest to betray Jesus. Over money. And Mark tells us that some people complained. John, in his gospel, is more specific. In fact, it's John that tells us that that particular dinner was before, that it was on Saturday before he came into Jerusalem. You see, what Mark is telling us is that at the beginning of chapter 14, that the Pharisees were starting to conspire. They're trying to find a way to trap him, to arrest him and kill him. But it was actually days before when they started this plot, because at this feast, this dinner, John tells us that it was actually Mary, Lazarus' sister, who broke this ointment over his head. And he tells us that it was only Judas that spoke up and said, "Why wasn't this sold? For 300 denarii sold." And we have an indication there that Judas wasn't so much concerned about the money and what we could give to the poor, but that he was the person who held the bag and he would take some of the money from it when he felt like it. 300 denarii, by the way, if you don't know, denarii was about a day's wage, so you're looking at almost an entire year's salary to buy this ointment that she broke open. Judas went out to betray him. And from that particular instance, it seems like Judas was just concerned about the money. He's angry that this is happening and that Jesus scolds him for saying that it could have been used to bring in money to give to the poor. And so he leaves. And it's interesting, if you understand it that way, that Judas actually went and talked with the priests on Palm Sunday or the day before to start to say, I can get Jesus for you. Let's just figure out a way to do it. So you jump forward to Wednesday morning, which is the day we're on. If you recall, Tuesday was last Sunday's sermon, chapter 13, looking at the questioning of Jesus in the temple area. And then moving out to the Mount of Olives and talking about what the signs of the end would be. We'll jump forward to Wednesday morning, the first day of unleavened bread. Jesus' disciples were asking him, where should we eat the Passover? And so if you know the story, or you can follow along in 14, he says, go into the city and you'll meet the jar man. And just follow him to wherever he goes. Whatever house he goes into, say, the master is looking for where we're going to have the Passover. Where's the guest room? And he said, he'll show you an upper room. There's where you will prepare the Passover. And then when it was evening, he came with the 12, and they were reclining at the table and eating. And Jesus said, truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, who is eating with me. And they start questioning. And he looks at him and he says, the Son of Man must go, as it's written. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that man if he had not been born. After the meal, they go back out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus predicts their fall. He says, you will all scatter. They're going to strike the shepherd, and the sheep will scatter. And Peter says, not me. He said, even though all fall away, I will not. And Jesus just looked at him and said, Peter, before the rooster crows twice, you're going to deny 3 times that you even know. Peter just very boldly says, I will die with you if I have to. And Jesus doesn't even have a response. Because they start going to the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus is going to pray. And he takes Peter and he takes James and John ahead, farther on into the garden from where the rest of the disciples set up to rest. And he says, wait here for me, I need to pray. And Peter didn't know. How could he know that this night was different than any other? Jesus just said, stay awake and watch. Keep watch for me while I pray. And Peter heard the beginning of his prayer before he fell asleep. He heard Jesus say, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. We know that Peter was one of the first of those 3 to fall asleep because John records a much longer prayer. John stayed awake longer. He heard more of what Jesus was saying. Peter, who said, I will die with you, couldn't stay awake. And Jesus comes back and finds all 3 of them asleep. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. So he walks further along again. He prays again, and he comes back a second time to wake them up. He does this a third time, and then the third time he comes back and he says, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. See, my betrayer is at hand. And there Judas was with the mob. And Judas had said to the mob, to the temple guard, he said, the one that I kissed, he's the one. Take him, bind him, and take him away. And Judas goes and he says, Rabbi, and gives Jesus a kiss. And then they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and the scribes came together. Peter followed carefully behind, and the chief priests were giving contradictory testimony to condemn Jesus. And the high priest stood up in the midst and said to Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it these men are testifying against you?" But he remained silent. And again the high priest said, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witness do we need? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. And they began to mock Jesus and to beat him. Someone started questioning Peter. They saw him over by the fire. They asked him if he knew Jesus. He was a Galilean. But you all know 3 times Peter swore that he had no idea who Jesus was. And then the rooster crowed. And then Peter wept. That's what happened in chapter 14. Jesus was betrayed. Betrayed by blasphemy. But my question to you this morning is, after hearing that chapter, after hearing the events that went on, who betrayed Jesus? And yes, it's a trick question. Because everyone knows Judas betrayed Jesus. He's the traitor. But after hearing what was going on in this chapter, I'm asking, who really betrayed Jesus? Judas? Peter? The priests? They all did. Why did they betray him? Why did Jesus get betrayed by Judas, one of his 12? Been with him for years. Why did Peter betray him? After swearing up and down he wasn't going to do it, he'd rather die. Why did the chief priests betray him? They knew he didn't do anything wrong. Their testimony was contradictory. They had nothing against him. Well, it comes down to the same motive that we talked about last week. Fear. Fear is the chief motive behind everyone who denies and rejects Christ. The Pharisees and the priests were afraid that they could lose control, they could lose power. If Jesus was who he claimed to be, they don't get to be in control anymore. If he's not who he claims to be and they let it go on, Rome will come down on their heads and they will not have the power and control that they've had anymore. They were worried about the fear of their own loss of status. And it didn't matter to them whether he was from God or not. Either way, they lose their status, and they didn't want that to happen. Peter betrayed Jesus. I don't know if you've ever considered that before. But he's standing there in the courtyard where Jesus is being spit on and beaten. And someone says, "You're with him." And Peter had the opportunity to stand up and say, "Yes, I am." You know, we saw in the preview for this movie when that guy's holding a gun to his face and says, "Do you really believe in Jesus?" We've heard stories of the Columbine incident where somebody had a gun put to their head and said, "Do you believe Jesus?" And they said yes. Peter swore he had no idea who he was. And I think that betrayal hurt Jesus more than Judas's. Because I believe it's in one of the other Gospels, and if it's not, it's in my mind because I've seen it in a video. But when he betrays him for the 3rd time, Jesus turns and looks at him. And that's what breaks Peter down. and he runs off. Peter was afraid that he could die. We're talking about this a little bit in Sunday school this morning. This is why I would encourage all of you to be there. If we need to, we can move it out here if we have too many people for that room, but there's so much more that we need to understand about the Bible that you just can't get from listening. You got to be involved, you got to ask questions, you got to give your thoughts. Well, we were talking this morning about what choices we make in the moment when the decision needs to be made, when there's circumstances around us that we have to fight or flight. How are you going to choose to follow Christ in a moment of commitment? In that moment where you could die or not die as a result of your choice? If you don't plan ahead of time for how you will answer that question, you will always answer it wrong. People don't say, yes, I believe Jesus, when a gun is to their head, because in that moment they just decide, hey, I'm going to be willing to die for Christ. It's because they live a life dedicated to that, always being willing to die for Christ. And that moment's just another one in their day, and something happens and they say, yes, I will follow him to death. If you're a Christian, if you believe in Jesus, if you've been trying to follow him, but you haven't made a decision like that before it happens, somebody will put a gun to your head and you will say, no, I don't. And don't think that you're any stronger than Peter, because that's what Peter said. And he was the leader of the first church. We need to prepare. All of last week's sermon, all of the chapter 13 was Jesus warning us to be on our guard, be prepared, because things are going to happen to you, and you can't wait until the moment it happens to decide how you're going to respond. You have to be committed to a response already. You don't decide on Sunday morning whether you feel like going to church or not. You decide as a lifestyle that I'm going to go to where God is. And when I can go there, I'm going to be there. And the only thing that stops you is if you're sick, if you're out of town, if you're unable to physically get there. You don't need to make a decision, because the decision was already made when you committed to it. But what was Judas afraid to lose? He didn't wait until somebody posed the question to him. He initiated it. The Pharisees had a chance of capturing Jesus because somebody on the inside could take them to where he hides in the evening when no one's around. What was Judas afraid of? I'll tell you what I think he was afraid of, and you may come to your own conclusions reading the Gospels, but I think he was afraid it was all falling apart. I don't think Judas doubted that Jesus was from God one bit. I think that he started hearing Jesus changing the way he talked. He wasn't talking about helping people and about God's love and about the kingdom growing and about all this great stuff that was going to happen to the nation. He started talking about his own death. He started saying that I've got to suffer, they're going to take me, and then it's okay when I come back. And Judas is starting to freak out. And this incident with this woman, Mary, breaking this stuff over his head, and he says, she is anointing me for my burial. And Judas is like, what? We have every indication that Judas believed in Jesus. Because he went to the Pharisees and he turned them in so that Jesus would have to destroy them to survive. He forced his hand. He had no idea that he was playing into the devil's hand. Because if he did, he would have been living happily and comfortably with 30 pieces of silver after Jesus was killed. But as soon as he realized his plan backfired, he gave them the money back. He threw it down. He said, we don't want your blood money. And he was so distressed that he killed himself. He was afraid to lose momentum. The force of Jesus' ministry was turning in a different direction. He was going to die. And he wanted to keep it going. You'll see in your bulletins the questions for the study of this chapter. But there are several sets of threes going on in this chapter. And I would appreciate it if everyone of you tried to look into those and find it. I gave you hints, I gave you the verses where they're happening. You just got to see it, you got to understand what's going on here. But the blasphemy that he was betrayed by wasn't his claiming to be God, the Son of God. The blasphemy he was betrayed by was the Pharisees refusing to recognize his position. It was from Peter denying. It was from Judas misunderstanding the purpose of his mission here. You know, blasphemy is a word that's kind of thrown out there for all sorts of things that people don't agree with. When you say something about God that's not true, when you say something about God that they don't believe, well, that's blasphemous. It's just an opposition to God. And every one of those groups of people in this chapter was in opposition to God, his point. Peter was forgiven, and so can you be. But you have to recognize what you're doing. Peter recognized that he was betraying Christ. And when Jesus appeared to him, resurrected, Peter fell to the ground, unworthy to even follow him any longer, but he fell to the ground in repentance. So my question to you this morning is, what are you afraid of? The art of love is not what you have, it's what you give. It's who you share it with. I recognize that Neil Diamond wrote this as a love song, and it's probably equally applicable to a woman and a man falling in love with each other. But that last line that he says in that song hit me. Because the art of love is who you share it with. It's not about you loving somebody else. It's about who you share love with. And God is love. And I want us to understand that as we come into Easter in a couple of weeks, that we're supposed to be about the Father's business. Every one of us is supposed to be drawing people towards Christ. We can't save anybody, but we can at least tell them about Him. We can at least say something about Jesus. We can at least invite them to join us for church on Sunday, on Easter, when most people are at least favorable to being a guest at a church. We could invite people here. We need to be doing this, or we don't really love. We're not responsible for the results. I'm not saying that every one of you has to find 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 people that get saved. I'm saying every one of us needs to be about sharing love. I was thinking about our church and some lofty goals, praying a lot about it, asking God to take us to 50 by the end of the year, and doubling us every year after that until we hit 400. For a while I thought that seems to be a little bit too ambitious, until it occurred to me that what does it take to double? Everyone bringing one. We each have a whole year to invite some people to church and see if one will come to Christ and stay. We have 52 weeks to find one person that can be saved, that can come to Christ. If we each did that, one person a year, we would double every year. And what's funny and what's interesting is that Jesus and God tells us from the very beginning, be fruitful and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. multiplying by 2 is the simplest, smallest multiplication you can do. And so I want that to be on our hearts. Who do I know that needs Christ? Who do I know that I can invite to be here, to come to the Easter breakfast, the Easter service, or to another service, or even just to an event? Somebody that I can introduce to the family who might come to know Christ. There's an argument, not really an argument, but a little bit of a debate on Facebook the other day. There's a mega church, has an internet ministry called eChurch, and they put a note out saying that they wanted to bless small churches. So they're giving this honor, blessing, and praise to small churches, and they mentioned any church that's under 400. And as you're laughing now, almost every comment on that list was, 400 is a small church? Are you even in reality? The average church size in America is only 75 or 80. And so these people were talking about these small churches, and I understand them. I understand where all these pastors were coming from, that smaller churches you can have more individual attention, you can know people. With a church more than 100, a single pastor can't know and minister to every individual anymore. Talking about smaller churches being able to focus and use your gifts, and that's one of the things that we can do in a smaller church. Everyone can be involved. You don't get pushed out. If you have a gifting, you can go and be a part. But I started seeing these pastors of small churches commenting in a way that seemed to be more justifying being small. One person said, the first church was 12. And that really bothered me. So I responded, and I didn't respond angrily. I said, I'm a pastor of a church of around 28, so I understand the ups and downs of trying to grow, the effort that it takes to grow. But when you say God's not interested in numbers, that's a lie. God is interested in souls, and every one of them is a number. The number of people that get to heaven, God is very interested in. And the first church wasn't 12. It was about 120. And it became 3,120 when Peter preached his first sermon. The first church of Christ was 3,000 people. There is no glory in being small, but there's also no glory in being great and large. I said there is no inherent unhealthiness in a megachurch, in the same way there is no inherent health in a small church. Just because you're small and you can be more involved doesn't mean that you are. Individually, we need to make a commitment to Christ. Individually, we have to choose not to deny Him any longer. We have to make a commitment that we are not going to betray our Christ, our God, our King anymore. And God is just amazing, the way He works things out. Because this movie that's coming out, that we're going to watch this afternoon, I think is saying exactly the same thing. Do you believe in the cross? That was a line from that preview. Do you believe in the cross? And the guy just kind of smiles at him and says, I'm a pastor. And the man says to him, and if you believe in the cross, the question is, what are you going to do about it? God cares about growth. He cares about people being saved. The only reason that this church is less than 50 at the end of this year is if we don't do what He's asked us to do. Share His love. Invite people to know Jesus.